In a world filled with emotional entanglements and supernatural miracles, a woman rediscovers the power of love on the brink of life and death. Experience this love story that transcends life and death, touching your heart and making you believe in the eternity of true love. Chapter 7 Spinning Tales. Alex patted the bed beside him and Grace stretched out, her left arm circling his shoulders. Once upon a time, she fumbled, trying to decide what came next. She stopped as the three girls from the playroom sidled in through the open door. Their chemotherapy treatments finished, they now roamed free from their 4 lines. They nodded to Alex, who didn't seem at all surprised to see them, and crowded together on the upholstered chair, one of them swinging her legs over the arm. "Not a fairy tale," he complained. "Those are for babies." "A love story," one of the girls chimed. "Nothing sad," her neighbor put in. "Happy ending," the last said, her heels bouncing off the side of the chair in emphasis. Grace frowned. "A love story with a happy ending. But nothing gushy, and it's okay if there's monsters and space aliens and stuff," Alex told her. "A monster and space alien love story, with nothing gushy or sad and no fairy tales, is that it?" she asked, more uncertain than ever that she could appease her discriminating audience. "Well, we maybe don't need the space aliens," Alex allowed. Grace took a deep breath. She was no good at this. Where was Jimmy with his blarney when she needed him? The chime of gold on gold came as Jimmy's hand covered hers, their wedding rings touching with a tone of pure harmony. She looked over to see Jimmy sitting on the other side of Alex. His right hand reached behind the boy, and suddenly the three of them were snuggled together like family. Alex sighed with contentment and his eyes closed, his breathing eased. The three girls beamed. Grace wondered for a split second if they could actually see Jimmy. Of course not, he was her hallucination and hers alone. It was still nice to have him here. "Tell them our story, love," he said, turning his wide smile on Grace. Of course. Not a fairy tale, and it had everything except for the space aliens, which were optional in any case. "Long ago and far away," she began, her voice steady and clear. Jimmy nodded his encouragement. "There once was a queen named Maeve. She was a good queen, a warrior as well as a diplomat. Some said she was a witch, others tried to call her a god, but she was just a woman. A woman who was strong and proud and worked hard to keep her people safe." "Yeah, Maeve." One of the girls cheered. Alex's face creased in a smile so Grace knew he wasn't asleep yet. "Do you want to hear more?" Grace asked, now enjoying her role as raconteur. "Where's the love story?" "Well now, that happens much later, more than 3,000 years later to be exact. You see, there was a great plague that fell upon Maeve's land. They didn't know it at the time, but a volcano had exploded and the cloud of dust blocked the sun all around the world." The children stared at her in rapt attention as Grace formed a large sphere with her hands. "You mean the whole world was dark, no sun?" one of the girls asked. "Like an ice age," Alex put in. "Almost. This happened in the fall. That winter was the worst ever seen, and it seemed never ending. Spring just never came." "That's not good." Grace nodded. "Not if you want to eat." So Maeve moved her people to the coast, hoping the sea would sustain them. She had to fight off many tribes of other starving people, people who wanted to survive as much as her clan. But she had to put her people first. That was her job as queen. Did she save them? Some of them. Enough so that once the dark years passed, her people survived and even prospered. Then a man betrayed Maeve and killed her. The girls all formed perfect O's of dismay with their mouths. Alex shifted on the bed, unperturbed by Grace's tale of villainy. "Waiting for the space aliens, no doubt." Jimmy chuckled, effortlessly following her thoughts. Her people buried Maeve in a hidden place, but over time they forgot where. Then one man began a quest to find her grave so the people would never forget their brave queen, who had once saved them all. Was he a knight? A prince? A space captain? The last was whispered by Alex. Grace shook her head. No, none of those. He was just an ordinary man. Jimmy wrinkled his nose and playfully pinched her at this. Well, maybe not so very ordinary. He was a professor. A what? One of the girls asked, her forehead creased in puzzlement. Like Indiana Jones, Alex put in, his eyes wide open now. Grace had no choice but to smile at that description. Kind of like Indiana Jones, she conceded. But this man's name was Jimmy Moran. He taught history. That doesn't sound very exciting. Sometimes ordinary people are the ones who do the most exciting things, Grace reminded them. Jimmy thought he found Maeve. He was very close to uncovering her grave. But then she paused and the girls leaned forward as one. Alex sucked in his breath and held it. Then it started to rain. Rain? That's nothing. As if to contradict Alex's words, a peal of thunder and lightning shook the window. Rain. But this rain was sneaky. It would be sunny for a while, then dreadful storms would move in. The island where Jimmy was searching for Maeve's grave was cut off. How did he escape? Now wait. One day during a nice spell a woman came to the island. Her name was Grace. Jimmy squeezed her hand at that, their rings sliding over each other. As Grace told the story, edited into a PG version the children would enjoy, she couldn't help but remember that day. The best day of her life, even if she had spent most of it soaking wet and freezing cold. Almost 6 years ago, and she was so very different now that the memory of those days seemed to have happened to a different person. Back then she had known no fear, had a reputation as a maverick among her fellow ER residents. A reputation hard won, that gave Grace a blush of pride when she heard nurses or paramedics discussing her latest exploits. Once upon a time, she had been fearless and brave. Like Maeve. Just 6 years and so much had changed. So much lost. She remembered the breathtaking beauty of the monastery on Inishmare, feeling steeped in a timeless embrace of tradition and a regal solemnity, as she entered the chapel ruins. The few remaining rock walls soared high overhead. Intricate round and arched latticed stone windows cast swirling shadows onto the ground as the wind scudded dark clouds across the sun. She had walked among the ruins, fingers tracing over carved images in the rocks, including the burial masks of several men, who appeared to have been entombed directly into the stone walls. The chiseled letters were worn, only the faintest etchings remained in the rock. She wished Brother Leo were here, he would have been able to read the ancient script. Were they saints? She wondered, crouching to look upon the peaceful visage of one resident. Warrior kings who had given their lives to protect the monks. Wise bishops. It was nice to dream about. Her own monks, holding back the darkness in their own small, quiet ways, would approve. A slab polished with time and countless bent knees was all that remained of the altar. Grace crossed herself and knelt, placing a hand on the ancient stone. It felt strangely warm, vibrating, as if with the sound of hundreds of male voices raised in praise. She could almost hear Brother Leo's voice, chanting along with the ancient, long-buried monks. Brother Leo had convinced her to come on this vacation with Linda, a friend who was a nurse in the ER. He'd said she needed time away from the hospital to explore new lands. He'd been right. Leo always had an uncanny knack of knowing what she needed before she did. A shadow chilled her. Thick raindrops splattered the grey stone. Dark clouds climbing in thick, woolly layers devoured the sun. She flipped up the hood of her Gore-Tex jacket, cursing Linda and her romantic impulses. Linda had paired up with a man from the village, who had brought them across Donegal Bay in his motorboat. The last Grace had seen of them, they'd had their heads together, examining the ring of standing stones on the hill above the monastery. The wind screeched through the holes riddling the ancient walls. Lightning struck nearby, shaking the ground. There was a small arched doorway behind the altar. She crossed through it, seeking shelter. It was a smaller room, still roofless. An iron door stood ajar in the side wall, and a set of worn rock steps led down. At least she'd be out of the weather. She took care on the rain-slicked steps. A small brass plaque bolted to the wall at the top of the stairwell announced that this was the entrance to the king's cairn. There was a thick rope attached to rings that acted as a safety railing. Grace followed it down the spiral of rough-hewn rock steps. Lights encased in weatherproof containers lined the walls, but none were lit today. Of course not, she thought, September is the low season. She remembered what the tour book had said. The King's Cairn was a large underground burial site dating back to the Bronze Age. It was accessible through tunnels monks had laboriously carved beneath the hillside, connecting with older passages constructed by ancient inhabitants 3,000 years ago. Grace glanced behind her. The rain was coming down harder, and showed no signs of letting up. Might as well be nice and dry and soaking up local history, she decided, taking her flashlight from her coat pocket and turning it on. The sharp beam of the keychain-sized maglight sliced the darkness like a stiletto. Grace made her way safely to the bottom of the steps to where another iron grate sat open. This one was only waist-high and led to a small tunnel carved into the hillside. Another thick rope served as a guide and safety rail. The passage was a little more than a yard wide and about the same in height. Cozy, but dry. She was certain if the lights were on this wouldn't intimidate her at all, but when she shone the light down the passage she could see no end in sight. "Alley, alley, oxen free," she called down. Her voice echoed pleasantly. The air was cool but not musty, obviously well circulated. There was no chance of getting lost not with the rope right there. This had better be worth it. She entered the tunnel and began to duck walk through the cramped space. Soon she came to a slightly larger passage, barely enough room for her to stretch to her full 5'6" without hitting the roof. There was a grille dividing the chamber. Plaques on the wall described the small space beyond the grille as the tomb of Concolin, king of the Westerlands at the time of the Roman invasions 2,000 years ago. Grace aimed her light between the bars that separated her from the ancient tomb and gasped. Intricate carvings, some of them only shadows on the rock, others highlighted by some sort of metallic pigment ground into the stone, flashed back at her. In the darkness they seemed to float, come alive, proclaiming to all the wondrous feats of the king buried there. She placed her hand flat against the rock wall, and felt the same vibrations she'd felt upstairs at the altar stone. It was just the rain, but it still thrilled through her body, as if a promise of something glorious about to happen. The air was charged with electricity and possibilities. Grace spent several minutes entranced by the tomb, finding new fascinating details with each flick of her light. She turned and saw that the tunnel continued further into the mountainside. It was a little chillier now. Glad for her jacket that enabled her to easily slip over the stones, she half crawled, half walked through the narrow passage. It spiraled through the mountain. She stopped to admire several more burial sites and areas of well-preserved rock art. At the last cavern, the deepest and oldest site, the plaque proclaimed that archaeologists were still hoping to find more sites, including the rumored burial ground of Maeve, the pagan queen who unified the island during the Dark Times, more than 1,000 years before Christ was born. Grace thought the tour ended there, but as she was turning to leave, her light found another tunnel. She crouched down to examine it. It was a little more narrow than the rest and there was no helpful rope guide, but there was no barrier across the entrance. The only sign she could find was a hand-painted arrow pointing down into the tunnel. Must be a new addition, she thought, easing her way through it. The roof sloped down a bit, and her legs were cramped from duck walking, so she rolled onto her belly and crawled head first. The air was if anything fresher, and she could feel a stir of a breeze. The mag light gleamed off a polished golden disc about 6 feet in front of her. It seemed to float in the darkness. She pushed forward and found herself falling through empty air. Momentum and the slick raincoat kept her moving. Her arms flailing before her, she flew into space, dropping a short distance before landing on her side. "Shit!" She shouted the epithet from her position on the muddy floor of the cavern. Other than having the breath knocked out of her and being scared silly, she found no obvious injuries. Except to her pride. Had to go on, keep exploring, couldn't have turned back when there was one more thing to see, could she? Brother Leo always said her stubborn pride would get her into trouble. Guess he was right. Grace caught her breath. The fall had knocked the flashlight from her hand. It wasn't completely dark though, she could make out hazy shadows coming from several angles far overhead. She remembered the other hillside burial grounds she and Linda had visited. Often the oldest and most revered sites were deep in the center, the remainder of the mountain built around them. The creators of these intricate tombs would cut vent holes and clever air shafts designed to allow fresh air in while protecting the burial site from the weather. Grace felt around her for her own light, squishing in the mud as she did. A cold stream of water ran up her jacket and she shivered. Then the stream became a current, pushing at her. She climbed to her feet and realized the mud and water that had broken her fall now swirled above her hiking boots. As water gushed in to chill her toes, she wondered at that. The tombs were designed to be dry. She splashed around until her fingers closed on her light. Still worked, thank God for mag light. Grace swung the light around and gasped. Brilliantly worked inlays of colored stones and bits of metal formed a mosaic on the wall opposite the tunnel. Intricate Celtic runes and knots were woven into the headdress and garment of the statuesque woman the mosaic portrayed. Was this Maeve's tomb? Water bubbled up out of the ground, rising fast, now almost to her knees. Slabs of mud, rock and clay slipped from the outer walls, splashing and allowing more water to drain inside. This was an island, Grace thought with panic. It's not just groundwater seeping in, it's the whole bay. The more that came, the more the very foundation of this man-made hill was being eroded. Now she understood the strange vibrations that haunted the rocks around here. It was water, busy devouring the island from the inside out. Grace spun around, searching for an escape route. The air vents were too high. If they were like the other cairns she'd visited, they most likely opened onto the hillside, concealed by well-placed rocks, sheltered, but where anyone could stroll past them. The tunnel's mouth grinned like a grey-on-grey jack-o'-lantern several feet over her head. Grace began calling out at the top of her lungs even, as she searched for handholds to scale the granite wall leading back into the tunnel. She quickly ran out of breath and fell back, gasping for air. The wall was smooth, polished by long-dead craftsmen. The water lapped at her thighs and the bottom of the chamber was filling with debris. Screaming never did anyone any good, just a waste of energy, she chided herself. So instead she began to sing, lifting her voice in all the Latin hymns she'd been taught as a child, the only female voice among a host of men. As she sang, her spirits lifted. With renewed energy she began to search for a tool, something to cut handholds into the wall below the tunnel opening. She carefully raked her fingers through the debris below the mosaic. There she found several lengths of plastic carefully weighted over a recent excavation, on a ledge cut into the wall. The water was not quite as high as this ledge, not yet at least, so Grace pulled the plastic from its anchors and climbed in. And came face to face with a skull, brown with age. She felt a crack under her knee and realized that she'd broken one of the delicate bones of the person buried in the wall of the cairn. Sorry, she muttered, ceasing her singing for a moment to get over the shock. Grave robbing and now desecrating the dead. If she got out of here in one piece, she'd be lucky if she didn't end up in jail. The light from her flashlight began to dim, as she used it to examine the body. Bits of fabric adhered to the bones, giving the ghoulish appearance of a mummy. The skeleton's hands clasped a semicircle of metal. It resembled the awls she'd seen Inuits use when she'd visited Alaska. A rounded knife with a handle forged from the same metal across the diameter of the half-circle. Just what she needed. Grace sent a little prayer to whatever gods guarded this ancient tomb and pried the blade from the brittle bones that clung to it. It wasn't as heavy as she expected, ridged with tracings carved into it. 2 more broken bones fell into her hand and she shoved them into her pocket, focusing on the knife. She struck it against the rock wall of the tomb and a spark flew. Too strong to be bronze, too old to be steel, and it wasn't heavy enough to be iron. She'd pay the fines for grave robbing, and let the archaeologists argue about it after she escaped. Her light died just as the water began to lap over the ledge. After hastily protecting the corpse in the plastic sheet once more, Grace half waded, half swam, across the cavern back to the wall where her escape tunnel beckoned to her. She began to stab the blade into the cavern wall, cursing as it slid off without doing much damage against the worn rock. "Damn near to hell!" she bellowed, venting her anger and frustration. "Would you just cut me a break here?" A blaze of light filled the top part of the cavern far overhead, and thunder shook the entire structure, loosening more mudslides. "Sorry," Grace cried out, covering her head, as the ledge around the tomb buckled and the rocks supporting it cascaded around her. The ground at her feet shifted in treacherous patterns, threatening to pull her down into the frigid water. Grace shivered and realized hypothermia would get her long before drowning. The mouth of the tunnel mocked her, so close yet so far. Just another foot or 2, she thought, stretching her arm as far overhead as she could. She slid the knife into her pocket, and began to feel around for rocks large enough for her to stand on. She would make her own cairn. And climb out on it. The work was hard and she slipped underwater several times, but was soon rewarded with a wobbly pile of small boulders. Gingerly she crawled to the top of it, then balanced herself against the wall, sliding her arm up, reaching for the edge of the tunnel. No good, she was still too short. She swept around searching for handholds, finger holds, anything she could use to free climb the wall, and found one small crevice excruciatingly to the side and over her head. She shifted all her weight, reached for the finger hold and leapt for it. Her feet dangling over the water, she grimly held on as her other hand and her toes scoured the rock, searched for additional holds. She focused everything on the 5 fingers keeping her suspended, ignoring the chills shaking her body or the pain in her muscles. Nothing, there was nothing she could grab onto. The realization came just as her strength gave way, and she plummeted into the water. The frigid blackness pulled her down, sucking her breath away. She flailed, hopelessly lost, searching for the surface. Chapter 8 From the Mouths of Babes. "That's enough for now," Grace whispered, gently moving Alex's head from her arm. He was snoring, soft corduroy rasps that echoed through the room. "What happens to Grace?" the girls asked, swirling around her as she escorted them from the room and closed the door behind them. "I'll bet she and Jimmy live happily ever after." Jimmy smiled at that and blew Grace a kiss before vanishing. Grace rubbed her wedding ring, still warm from his hand. "Maybe," she said, trying hard not to allow sorrow enter her voice. "Would you like to come to our tea party?" one of the girls asked. "Brittany, no grown-ups allowed." Brittany grabbed Grace's hand. "Grace isn't grown up. She's just like us, aren't you, Grace? We want to hear more. Please?" The girls pulled and tugged until Grace found herself seated at the miniature table in the playroom, her knees bumping as she perched in a child-sized chair. "I'm Tiffany," said the girl who had originally protested Grace's invitation. Obviously the leader. "This is Brittany," she pointed to the ebony-skinned girl. "And Heather." The last girl, the one who rarely spoke, nodded shyly at Grace. "I'm Grace." The girls giggled in unison. "We know, silly." Grace blinked, then remembered Brittany using her name earlier. How had they known who she was? What happened? Tiffany asked as she poured pretend tea for them all. Were you scared? Down there in the dark, all alone except for moldy old Maeve, Brittany put in. I'll bet it was kind of fun. What happened next was totally up to you. But it wasn't, Heather finished in her quiet voice. The rest nodded their agreement. Grace was surprised at their understanding. They were only 8 or 9 years old at most. But she guessed if they were here receiving intensive chemo, then they probably did have some idea of what it felt like to face mortality. Free and yet terribly bound to fate at the same time. Tell them, Jimmy urged, reappearing across the room, leaning against the glass wall. A nurse looked in, through Jimmy's transparent image, and Tiffany smiled at her. Or was she smiling at Jimmy? Grace wondered with a chill, facing these 3 bald, young but much too old girls. Go ahead, Tiffany said, delicately sipping at her tea, her pinky extended. Tell us what happened next. Of course she couldn't tell them everything that happened after she discovered Maeve's tomb, the blood, the pain, the terror. But she could tell them the happy parts, and they had been happy, hadn't they? Jimmy smiled at her and nodded his encouragement. Grace took a deep breath before beginning, trying to bottle up all the emotions that talking about their first meeting stirred up. She felt ancient now. Yet back then, only a few short years ago, she had felt hopelessly young, anxious to face life on her terms and prove herself. Fool. She remembered falling, careening off the sheer wall. This time she had bounced off several rocks and into the water. She came up shrieking for air, retching against the volume of water she'd inadvertently swallowed. The water was now high enough that the only way to keep her head above it was to tread vigorously. But at least it had stopped rising. Damn it! She screamed in fury as she swung her limbs, trying to find solid ground to stand on. Her small cairn had tumbled down. She was cold, wet and tiring fast. Grace tilted her head back, the better to breathe, and saw a bright light dancing over the mosaic on the other side of the cavern. She wasn't dead yet, she cursed at the brilliant light, not realizing she'd shouted the words until their echo rained back down on her. Not dead yet. She shouted again, liking the sound of the words. So I see, came a voice from above. Would you be wanting some help, then? Grace gaped as the voice was joined by a man's grinning face, disembodied, as it hung over the edge of the tunnel. The light glowed off his fair skin and shimmered over red hair laced with shadows that made him appear to be the devil incarnate. The last thing she saw before he disappeared was a set of perfect, gleaming white teeth. Then there was a loud splash, and a light shone on a length of rope thrown down to her. Tie it around your waist and wait for my signal. With numb hands Grace did what she was told, looping the rope between her legs before cinching it at her waist in what she hoped was a secure knot. Ready? Grace moved to brace herself. Her feet had no purchase against the floor of the cavern, so she leaned back, planting them against the vertical wall. Ready, she called back, surprised at how cheery her voice sounded. The rope went taut. Her rescuer's grunt of effort echoed through the cavern. Grace pulled herself hand over hand, walking up the vertical wall. When she collapsed onto the tunnel floor, she was amazed at how wonderful dry, non-moving rock could feel under a person who needed mattresses. She could fall asleep right here. You all right, now? Rough hands ran over her arms and torso, checking for injuries. Ain't hurt anywhere. I'm fine, she mumbled, wishing he'd leave her to her slumber. Then what the bloody hell were YA doing in my tomb? His shout shook her awake like an earthquake of modest proportions. The light moved away as he crawled up the tunnel. Bloody Yanks, don't have the sense God gave a turnip. Couldn't you read the signs that said no entrance? He shot over his shoulder, shining the light at her. Grace hadn't moved. You're not expecting me to carry you out, now are YA? He said, scorn evident in his voice. When she didn't respond, he continued, "Not just a yank. A bloody female yank. Can't think for herself, much less get herself out." "Shut up already," Grace found the energy to snap back. "I'm coming." She began the weary task of hauling herself back through the tunnel, propelled by his sarcasm and her own anger. What signs? She thought, ignoring the pain cramping every muscle, as she clawed her way into the cavern where she'd found the arrow directing her to the cavern that had almost been her final resting place. "Where are those warning signs you were crowing about?" she asked, using the opportunity to sit on the rock floor and catch her breath. Her rescuer was climbing into the next tunnel, oblivious to her fatigue, when he turned and shined his light over the walls of the cavern. "Right there," he said, then his voice faltered as the light hit the oh-so-helpful arrow. "Ah, there's where they should be. Paddy promised me." Grace sighed and got to her feet, ignoring him as he continued to swirl the light around, searching for non-existent warning signs. She climbed into the next tunnel, knowing the sooner she got out of this hellhole, the sooner she'd be warm and dry. "You coming or not? Next time I see Paddy O'Dwyer, he's a dead man," he muttered as he climbed into the tunnel behind her. He continued his tirade as they slowly made their way to the base of the stairs leading up to the monastery. Grace looked up at the seemingly endless circular steps and slid down the wall to sit on her heels. She shook her head, wrapped her arms around her wet body, unable to control her shivering. "I don't know your name, but thank you," she said after she caught her breath. "Jimmy. Jimmy Moran. And you're welcome." His voice was sheepish now. "I'm sorry about the warning signs. I didn't know." She waved off the rest of what he was saying. "How'd you come to find me, anyway?" "I thought I was going to become a permanent resident." "You would have been in good company, I can tell you that." He paused. "We've been worried that with all the rain this year, a big storm could weaken the foundation of the cairn. I came over to check on things when I ran into your mates. Linda and TJ. Are they all right?" "A little wet is all. I sent them back to the mainland. That TJ needs to learn how to listen to a weather forecast. He should have known better than to bring you girls out here with a storm brewing." Since he'd just saved her life, Grace ignored his use of the appellate, girls. "It was sunny, beautiful this morning in Lissadell." He grunted. "Anyway, I'm walking back over the hill and I hear an angel singing between thunder booms. I'm thinking I've been struck by lightning, on me way to meet St. Peter hisself when next I hear a most ill-tempered cursing. I say to myself, Jimmy me boy, that's no angel. So I hurry inside here and the cursing is getting louder, so I just follow it, like chasing a rainbow to a pot o' gold." Grace almost laughed. His accent grew thicker even as he piled the bullshit deeper. "Voice like an angel indeed." She climbed to her feet, swaying for a moment until his hand steadied her. "Just a wee bit further then I'll get you warm and dry, some hot soup," he promised her. She let him keep his hand around her waist, helping her up the twisting stairs. She had to admit, it felt nice. Warm, strong, everything. She was not right at that moment. By the time they made it back to the monastery, the storm had grown in intensity. Jimmy turned her into him, his head bowed against hers as he fastened her hood around her face and cinched it tight, as if she was a child. It was as dark as night except for sheets of lightning raining down on them. He shouted to be heard above the wind and thunder. "It's not far. Just follow me." He took her hand in his and led the way with the flashlight. Several times Grace slipped on the wet grass and stumbled over hidden rocks and tree limbs. Each time he caught her before she hit the ground. Her teeth chattered and she couldn't feel her hands or feet, but she didn't complain. A short time later they reached a large, white stone building shaped like a beehive oven, but almost 2 stories tall. Her guide bent forward and loosened a top, the wind twisting it immediately from his fingers. He gave her a gentle push, and she doubled over and scuttled inside the dark but dry room. He accompanied her, handing her the flashlight as he fought to re-secure the top. She held the light for him with both hands, but still couldn't keep it from shaking. He strode past her, and soon there was a whoosh and the room was lit with the glow of a Coleman lantern, quickly joined by a second, then a third. He returned to her, taking the flashlight from her numb hands and turned it off. "You're freezing," he said. She couldn't stop her teeth from chattering long enough to respond. "Christ, even your lips are blue." "Damn it, Moran, why'd you not think of that? Could have built a fire, brought a top or something." As he carried on his monologue, Grace had the feeling he often talked to himself. He moved around the round room, opened a bright red backpack, and pulled out various items of clothing. Some he rejected, others he smelled, testing them, then shrugged and brought her an assortment. "Can't vouch for how clean they are, but they are warm," he assured her. He placed the bundle into her arms and turned her to face the wall. "You change, I'm going to build a fire," he told her. "Unless you need help." She shook her head, dropping the clothing to her feet as she worked her way free of her mud-soaked clothes. Her boots were the hardest, but she finally was able to fumble them off with fingers thickened by the cold. She slid into the flannel shirt and fleece pullover he'd brought her, delighting in the feel of the soft, dry fabric against her numb skin. Next, she pulled on a pair of sweatpants, rolling up the cuffs to make a ridiculous poof around her ankles. She turned around, and saw he'd built a fire in a stone ring. He sat with his back to her, bent over a smartphone. "The monks used these beehive huts for periods of private meditation," he told her. "Brilliant design, don't you think? Warm in the winter, cool in the summer, efficient without being claustrophobic. A little dark when the sun's not direct overhead, but you can say that about most places round here. You doing all right?" "Yes, thank you," she told him, leaving her pile of wet clothes to join him by the fire. The floor of the hut was dirt, but it was hard-packed so it almost felt like concrete. He took her hands in his and began to examine them. She'd broken several nails to the quick, and her palms were abraded by her attempts to free climb the wall of the cavern. "Christ almighty," he said, looking upon her with admiration. "You a scrappy one, ain't you? Did you think I was just spending my time down there singing?" she asked. He rubbed his fingers over her calluses. "I'm a pretty good climber. Just couldn't find a handhold. The storm's only getting started, we'll be stuck here a day or so," he told her. "How do you know?" He held up his iPhone and grinned. "Ain't technology a blast?" In the light of the lanterns and the fire she could see that his features weren't really that of a devil incarnate, despite his rough manner. His hair was fair, a shade redder than blonde, but too light to be called auburn, long and a little ragged, as if it hadn't been cut in a long while. His eyes were hazel and he was trim, well-muscled. "I sent emails to your hotel so your friend would know you're safe and sound." "Thank you, Mr. Moran, Jimmy Moran." He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "And who do I have the pleasure of rescuing?" "Grace D'Angelo," she told him, wishing he'd stop smiling at her like that. Frown lines bracketed his eyes. "Italian? I would have thought with those eyes and skin." He trailed off and shrugged. "I could be anything," she said, sliding her hand away from his warm grasp. "Right, you Yanks, always proud of your melting pot." He turned away to pour something from a pot on the Coleman stove into a mug. He handed it to her and returned to his seat with his own cup. "Course, that doesn't stop you all from coming over here and pretending to be Irish. Not that we mind, it brings good money in." He peered at her again, as she drank the instant soup he'd made. "Sure there's no Irish in you?" "No," she snapped. She flinched at the wounded look in his eyes and regretted her shortness. "You'd think after all these years, she'd get used to people asking." "I mean, I'm not certain what my heritage is," she amended. "I was abandoned as a newborn." She sipped at the soup and waited for the inevitable barrage of questions. He pursed his lips and considered her statement. "Reckon that could be confusing," he finally allowed. "You're just lucky you don't live around here where everyone knows each other's family tree gone back generations. All of it coming back to haunt the current generation, of course." His face broke into a wicked grin as he mimicked an old lady, eyes squinted almost shut, mouth curled up in disapproval. "You're Jimmy Moran of the Clifton Morans. Your great-great-grandfather twice removed was a thief, got himself branded for stealing my granda's cattle to boot. YA should be ashamed of yourself. The apple don't fall far from the tree, I always say." Grace laughed, threatening to spill her soup. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her newly thawed muscles. "I never thought of it that way. Course, if YA were from here, you'd have the nuns to contend with as well." "What, Jimmy? You don't have all the lives of the saints memorized. Saints preserve us, lad, you've got to shape up or you'll be going straight to hell, and nothing we do will save you. What would your poor, sainted mother be saying then?" The mincing tones of his mimicry echoed through the room. Grace nodded, feeling warm both inside and out. "Don't worry, I had both nuns and monks." She launched into a vulgar Latin parody of the Sanctus that Brother Leo had taught her in one of his weaker moments. Both of them paid dearly come confession that week. To her surprise, Jimmy joined in, his baritone mixing nicely with her clear alto. "I didn't think any girls knew that one," he said, chuckling when they finished. "Do you know what the words mean?" "Of course, I was speaking Latin almost before English." He arched an eyebrow at that. "I was left swaddled in the arms of a statue of the Virgin Mary," she explained. "At the entrance to a Franciscan monastery outside Loretto, Pennsylvania. A Jesuit monk was staying there on sabbatical. He found me, convinced the brothers to keep me, raise me." Moran shook his head at her story. Grace finished her soup, relieved he hadn't laughed. It was the first time in a long time, that she'd told anyone the truth about her upbringing. Christ, what an awful thing to do to a baby. "I don't know. It wasn't a conventional upbringing, but I had a good time. When I got older, they sent me to live at a convent. Somehow Brother Leo wrangled it so he and the Society of Jesuits were my official guardians. I never had to contend with the horror of the foster care system." She shrugged, remembering the monk with fondness. He'd seemed ancient to her as a child, but she realized now he could have been only in his 30s. But somehow, despite all the years in her eyes, he never seemed to change in appearance. Flowing silver-gray hair, his one act of rebellion he called it, a wrinkle-free face, as if he'd long ago been set free of earth-bound worries. This Leo, he wouldn't be a Leo Augustine, would he? "Yes. Do you know him?" She stretched out her legs and noticed the Duquesne University logo on the borrowed sweatpants she wore. "You've visited Pittsburgh. Is that where you met Leo?" "I live there now." He nodded at the logo. "That's my school." She looked over at him. It was impossible to guess his age, could be anywhere from 30 to 50. The only lines on his face were tiny crinkles at his eyes when he smiled or frowned. "What do you do there?" "I'm a professor of history," he told her. She raised her eyebrow in disbelief. "Now, you didn't think that I rescued damsels in distress as a full-time occupation, did you?" "Leo and I taught a course together, Comparative Mythology of Early Christianity and Ancient Ireland. He's the one who helped me get the grant I needed to come here this year." Basking in the warm glow of the fire and Jimmy's whiskey-smooth brogue, she smiled. What was one more minor miracle? Her life had been chock full of them so far, many thanks to the meddling of a certain Jesuit. Jimmy's laugh filled the small space, echoing pleasantly from the stones surrounding them. "Guess I owe the good brother a pint next I see him." "So he did save you." Brittany leaned back with contentment at the happy ending. "And you and Jimmy lived happily ever after," Tiffany said. What about Maeve? All his work. I thought Grace would end up saving Jimmy, Heather said, frowning. Budding feminist, Grace thought, lifting her eyes to meet Jimmy's. She did, she said, speaking of herself in third person. But it's getting late, and that's another story. The girls groaned, recognizing a hook when they heard one. Tomorrow, Grace promised them, stretching her cramped legs and regaining her feet. Thanks for the tea. Grace, where are you going? Heather asked, a hint of anxiety in her voice. Grace was going to go back upstairs, sneak a peek at Kat's chart, try to figure out why the ECU gave off such disturbing vibes. As much as the place made her feel uncomfortable, she felt drawn to it. Be careful the witch doesn't get you, Brittany told her. Grace spun around. She crouched before the three girls, huddled together now, holding hands. Do you know what happens up in the tower? She asked. On the 7th floor. They nodded. Bad things. And it's spreading. She wants Vincent. She wants it all. Wants everyone to join her in her world. But none of it's real. It's only what they want to see. It's not real, Heather repeated, taking Grace's hand and squeezing it tight, as if this was vital information. Grace nodded, even though she didn't understand any of it, their words resonated with the churning in her gut. She circled the three in her arms, squeezing them tight until the giggles of little girls supplanted the ominous portents. But when she looked up to find Jimmy, he had vanished. Chapter 9 Dark of the Moon. Jonas Hellman used to have a life. He used to have it all, wife, 2 kids, dog, house in the burbs, even a minivan. Then he found his addiction and lost it all. Best thing that ever happened to him. Adrenaline and power were his drugs of choice. He craved them constantly. Every waking moment was spent in the pursuit of one, or the other or both. It was 10:30 at night, the OR manager reminded him as she turned the lights off in the other rooms. Hellman ignored her. Wilson, his assistant, adjusted the screws that held the cadaver's head in precise location in the center of a ceramic halo. Hellman glanced up, did some mental calculations, then realigned it a bit so that the holographic image of the MRI fit precisely. He donned his goggles and lit up the laser, and began slicing into the cadaver's brain. Damn it! Hellman yanked his goggles off and hurled them across the room. He'd just disintegrated the dead man's hippocampus. If resurrected, the corpse would have awakened without any memories, or the ability to lay down new ones. Sir, if you'd let me tie the laser to the computer guidance. Shut up, Wilson. The operating tech obeyed, clamping his lips together until they formed a single thin line. What the hell's the good if I let a machine do the damn surgery for me? Wilson knew better than to answer. Hellman paced the room. Reset to the thalamic lesion, let's run that one. Wilson turned to the computer, his shoulders hunched, presenting the smallest possible target to the irate surgeon. The holographic image changed, still the same cadaver's brain, but with a new lesion programmed into the images. The idea was that with a precise map of both the normal and cancerous tissue of the brain, the laser could be guided to obliterate tumor and spare the rest. It worked perfectly when the computer programmed the laser's movements. Wilson judiciously did not remind his boss of this. Hellman held his hand out and Wilson scrambled to retrieve the goggles from the floor, then darkened the overhead lights. I'm gonna get you this time, Hellman murmured as his fingers delicately nudged the laser on its path of destruction. Computer, my ass. If medicine was as much an art as a science, then neurosurgery was the fucking Sistine Chapel, and he was Michelangelo. Hellman finished his work and gestured for the room lights. Take that, you bastard. Computer says there's 1.56% residual tumor remaining, Wilson told his master in a low voice. What? Now it's saying I wimped out. Let's see it do better without taking out the thalamic tract. Wilson punched the keys and they watched as the computer guided the laser's bursts of energy. It only took a few seconds. Hellman rushed forward to inspect the brain, while Wilson waited for the computer's tally. 100% tumor-free, only 2.3 mm encroachment onto healthy tissue. Hellman shook his head. It was impressive work, but done by a damned machine. He wanted this technique to be his masterpiece, not the product of some mindless pile of circuit boards and wires. He even had a name for it, the Hellman process. His legacy. Let's try another, Hellman told his assistant, ignoring the other man's sigh of fatigue. We are not going anywhere until I can take on Grace Moran's tumor and beat that fucker. Vincent was in his office on the 3rd floor, emptying the extraneous papers from his lab coat, his last ritual before leaving for home. Not that anything or anyone special was waiting for him at home, or had been for a long time. Damn lawyers and their malpractice cases. His life would be perfect if it wasn't for the Engaijins. He'd have his staff appointment locked in, salary negotiated, signing bonus in hand for a down payment on a condo in Shadyside, and a new car to put in the parking lot. Instead, all he had to go home to was microwave pizza in a Squirrel Hill studio, his dinner companion a stack of bills, all past due. The last papers to spill from his pocket were the notes from the Neurosurg conference. Grace Moran, the woman with the tumor Hellman was planning to make history removing, still haunted Vincent had been all day. He couldn't seem to get her out of his mind, imagining the circumstances that brought her to this juncture. It was so unlike him. Usually he prided himself on his detachment, his ability to remain objective. It was fascinating to imagine the freedom that might come from knowing that you possibly only had a few days to live. Eve Warden said the brain mapping would take a day at least, so in reality Hellman's patient would be confined to the ECU during the time before her surgery. But in Vincent's imagination, she was living out her dreams. A trip to Tuscany. Breakfast at Tiffany's. Diving with dolphins in Maui. The possibilities were enticing, especially after knowing the woman had been a virtual prisoner in her own house for the past several years. He scanned the notes again. Vincent sat down at the utilitarian desk and used his computer to access Grace Moran's medical records. One of the few perks of being the chief resident. Still had the same lousy pay and rotten hours, but he had his own private office and call room for the year. If the place had a window, he might consider moving in, saving money on rent. Might still if the Engaijins won. Grace Moran was listed as a patient in the ECU, but there weren't any vital signs or notes detailing her progress today. Her phone number and address were included with her other demographic information, including the fact that she was not married. He was surprised to see that she lived only a few blocks away from him. Her occupation was listed as web consultant. Good job for an agoraphobic. One previous admission to the trauma service almost 5 years ago. No psych admissions listed. Maybe she wasn't as crazy as Hellman painted her. Might be interesting to wander back over to the ECU, meet her in person. Then he shook his head and cleared the computer screen. Was this what his life had come to? Stalking a patient. Worse was the tinge of envy he felt about Grace Moran. The woman was facing an operation that would probably, despite Hellman's boasting, kill her. Yet somehow, he almost wished he was in her place, had her freedom. He deliberately folded his notes in half, let them fall. Caught in the breeze from the vent, the white sheets of paper fluttered through the air like angel wings. Vincent stared at them, head bowed as he stood beside his desk, frozen for a moment in time. He felt light-headed, unsure which direction to move in. Finally, the papers hit the bottom of the trash can with a slapping sound that woke him from his trance. The sound of a fastball hitting a glove. The sound of cement landing on a trowel. The sound of someone, somewhere doing something. But not Vincent. He stood there, vision blurred as he stared at the simple white sheets of paper, motionless. Vincent clicked the overhead light off, shut the door and headed for the elevator. He had to get out of here. Just wished he had somewhere worth going to. Maybe he should reconsider Eve Warden's offer, both the business partnership as well as the social one. Lucas tossed and turned, his dreams shrouding him in the past, taking him back to the first time he had seen his father having sex with a woman. He was 9. The woman was not his mother. In fact, he later learned from his mother that once he was conceived and his mother had produced a male heir to carry the upstanding Redding name into the next millennia, his father never touched her again. He'd heard a woman screaming and rushed into his father's bedroom. Then stopped. The plush Persian rug beside his father's bed had been shoved aside. A strange woman was on the hardwood floor, on her hands and knees, naked. His father was still dressed. He grabbed the woman's hair in his fist and slapped her, hard. Harder than he ever slapped Lucas, even. The woman cried out, but her lips were bared in a wide smile that revealed a mouthful of yellow, rotting teeth. She turned her head and made eye contact with Lucas, then laughed. "Go back to your crayons and baby dolls, little boy," she said. Earl Redding whirled around, still holding the woman up by her hair. "Shut up," he told her. "That's my son you're talking to, and he'll be a man soon enough." Unlike Lucas' mother, Earl had never been employed. It was just the two of them rattling around in the Redding family's Fox Chapel mansion. Except for the servants, of course. Under other circumstances Lucas would have been proud at his father's words. Weeks could go by with Earl never making eye contact with Lucas or otherwise acknowledging his son, leaving Lucas alone with his computer and cyber tutor. Then when he did deign to notice his offspring, it was always to point out Lucas's failings and dole out suitable punishment. Lucas glanced at the woman. It was the first time he'd ever seen a woman naked. She caught his expression and laughed again. The sound was shrill, echoing from the vaulted ceiling of the large room. Earl Redding lunged forward, gripping her long, stringy hair in his fist, yanking her head up as he kicked her. She yelped, an animal noise of fear and pain. Only Earl's hold on her hair kept her from slumping to the floor. Earl began to kick and pummel her with his free hand, his smile growing wider with each blow landed and every cry uttered. Entranced, Lucas took a step forward. Then another. Earl paused, looked Lucas in the eye and grinned. "Never let the bitches think they are better than you. You take control, you hear me? You make them do what they are supposed to do." The woman was now sobbing, tears streaming down her face, twin rivers of black mascara, and blue eyeliner. Earl reached for Lucas, pulled him closer. "Go ahead, son. Show her who's boss." Lucas hesitated only a moment, the gleam in his father's eye frightening him. If he didn't do what his father wanted, would his father hit him, too? The woman was a grown-up, he was just a kid. Also, there was this strange new sensation in his groin, a warm tingling that made him wonder if he might also someday have the same monstrous power to command as his father. He swung his fist into the woman's face, bouncing off her cheekbone. It hurt, but it also felt good, especially when her nose began to bleed. He hit her again and again, but the initial nosebleed was the worst damage he inflicted. His father's laughter stopped him. That was Lucas's first lesson in sex. Earl must have felt his performance enhanced by his son's presence, or maybe it was simply one more form of revenge on his too successful absent wife, but he began to order Lucas to join him for lessons, on a regular basis. It was the only father-son bonding Lucas had until he was 14 and finally killed the bastard. Maeve goes into the light. Loch Roscommon, era 1630 BC. Maeve slid beneath the placid surface of the dark waters and allowed herself to float, to simply be, released of all boundaries and responsibilities. She loved bathing alone at night like this, especially when the moon was bright and the stars shimmered and danced above her. It was so unlike the way nights had been during the dark times. No moon, no stars, only a murky shadow that shrouded the land. She tilted her head back, dipping all her hair into the cool waters, and sighed. How much had been lost back then? So long ago that the trees now standing guard over her hadn't existed. Most of her people no longer spoke of those times, they were merely a fairytale used to scare children. Not to Maeve. She still dreamed of those dark days of endless night. Especially of the day when she was forced to kill Lothar, her brother. As she floated in the quiet lake, bathing in moonbeams and quiet water, Maeve shivered. Tonight could tonight be the night. Twisting her body to the right and the left, she scanned the perimeter of the lake. All was quiet. Except her memories. Those she couldn't silence. She quelled her nerves, finished her bath, and returned to shore. As she emerged from the lake, a man's form separated itself from the shadows beneath the trees. "Forbade," she said, standing upright before her nephew, not bothering to cover her nakedness. He had chosen his ambush well. She was alone, unarmed. But not surprised. For 22 years she had been waiting to pay the blood debt. Maeve, he spat her name like a curse. He was less than an arm's breadth away. His face was raw, chiseled with sharp angles. She took a single step towards the pile of clothing that concealed her weapon. But stopped when he raised the short sword, her sword, from behind his back, twisting it so moonlight danced over its wickedly sharp edge. The same edge which had killed his father. Before Maeve could move to defend herself, Forbade thrust the sword at her. The blade whistled through the air, impaling her. She reached for the hilt, her hands covering his. His eyes were lit by a righteous fire as he leered down at her. He twisted the blade once, his grin widening as Maeve cried out. Another man's arm snaked out of the darkness, wrapping itself around Forbade's neck and choking him until he dropped to the ground. Maeve sank to her knees, her hands still wrapped around the sword hilt. The pain that shot through her was now a mere trickle of agony, but she felt her life slipping away with it. The second man crouched beside her, lowering her gently onto the rocks. She strained to focus and saw it was her old friend, Leonid. The druid who had led her and her people to salvation so long ago. "You should have listened to me, Maeve," he chided her, his silver hair streaming over his shoulders and framing a miraculously unlined face. 22 years had passed, yet Leonid had not aged. What kind of marvel was this? She reached a hand out to him, beckoned him closer. "You could have had it all, Maeve," he continued, regret in his voice. "You could have ruled the world, changed history forever." She managed to shake her head. "No," she choked out. "It was always meant to be this way." "No. No, it's not." His dark eyes grew fierce. "Not if I have anything to do with it." Maeve tried to speak again, but her throat had filled with a fluid she recognized as her own blood. She felt nothing, not pain, not the night breeze, not Leonid's hands as he cradled her. Her vision dimmed, her eyes fluttered shut. Then she opened them again in shock. Leonid had leaned forward. He lay his mouth over hers and kissed her, drawing her breath into his body in an act more intimate than any she had ever shared with a lover. As he held his mouth over hers, she watched the stars above her swirl and spin, as if she were falling into the night sky. She looked down and saw her body, Leonid still hovering over it. His voice came from a great distance. "Sorry, my queen, but someone will be needing this in a few thousand years." Leonid stood and with a mighty jerk, pulled free the blade that had impaled her. Maeve felt a flutter of curiosity, even as she spun farther and farther away. Then it too was gone, a handful of sand tossed into the churning ocean of night. Is your heart racing? This is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to our channel, and don't miss a single thrilling twist in Grace's story.